on Facebook.
You're just a member, you should be seeing everything that anybody sees.
Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Flesor Beck, who joins us from the small town of Tascola in central East Illinois. Dr. Flesor is a third-generation confectioner and the author of the book Sweet Greeks, First-Generation Immigrant Confectioners in the Heartland. Her book is based on her PhD dissertation at the University of Illinois on the same subject, which is also the subject of her lecture this afternoon. As always, we will close the lecture with a questions and answer session. You can type your questions at any time during or after the lecture by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to open another screen where you can type your questions. Those who may be attending the event on Facebook can type their questions on the comments box on the left or at the bottom of the screen. I'm joining you from Nafplion, Greece. If there would be any technical problem with the internet connection to this lecture, Stefanos Sakelaridis will take over with the questions and answer session. Dr. Flesor, the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of, oh, wait a minute. My husband is okay. I have my husband, Dr. Roger Beck, with me, who's my technical person. So we'll blame any issues on our end. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to share my grandfather's life, which is kind of the story that threads through my dissertation material and the book Sweet Greeks. Most of the first generation Greek immigrants coming to America at the end of the 1800s into the first part of the 20th century became confectioners before they morphed into other fields, if you will, which is very different from some of US scholars who came to this country after World War II. So this is, it's a really great story, and it's a rural story. And we were talking earlier before the program started about is this rare information? And in a way it is. A lot of great scholars that have come before me, Theodore Salutos and Charles Moskos, working with Steve Frangos, have focused primarily on urban areas, Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, New York. Steve Frangos has done a lot of work on rural areas too, but this is kind of the first time stories have been told about Greeks who disseminated out of the urban areas and went to small towns all across the country. I happen to live in central Illinois, and so I chose my grandfather's story as the prime example weaving through. Behind me is our store. This is, and we call it the store. A lot of Greek confectionaries and Greek families would call their businesses the store. And we are still open. My sister and I reopened it in 2004. You are looking at a picture of us behind the soda fountain. As we mentioned, as I had mentioned, that most of the Greeks who came to this country at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s came from the Peloponnese region. And this was kind of a narrative that was repeated thousands of times all across the country. Greeks came to America because of many reasons. Those of you who know the landscape in Greece, the Peloponnese is very hilly and mountainous. And most of the residents lived in small villages and relied on subsistence farming. And they barely eked out a living. My grandfather would comment on how poor their family was. My grandfather lived in Pigadokia. Are you able to pull that up?
Supposedly doing that, but
okay. Which is kind of in the middle of the Peloponnese. And he lived on a farm there in a very, very small village. at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, only 8%.
Sorry, I think we can see the screen share now.
Okay, we can't see it, but that's okay.
Well, no, we can't change the things if we don't.
Okay, no, hold on a minute.
Okay. What? I don't get it.
I don't know what's happening either. I don't know why we're
Why
not.
don't you put that and then just click on? Don't do that, Roger.
I
That-
can share my screen. Okay,
Okay,
There we go.
okay. Are we all
this
on?
is mine. I'm sharing my screen. So
Yeah.
you give me
Okay.
cues and I can start, I can move the slides around.
Okay. Can you
Uh,
move the
before
slides?
that-
We can't move them around.
Um,
Could you go to the second slide then?
Yeah, hold on a minute.
let's do
Sorry.
the slideshow
Uh,
too.
Huh?
Do the slideshow too.
I don't know what,
He needs to do this.
I asked him to show the second slide. Okay, can we show it? There we go.
There you
Can
go.
can you all see that?
Ask people if they can see it.
Yay, yes?
You want to do the slideshow?
I can see it.
We
Okay,
can see it on the side, but not at the center.
you can
I
see-
don't know.
I don't get it. Yeah,
Hold on a minute. There is something, okay.
okay. Anyway, well, this is my
Okay.
grandfather. I think everybody can see this.
Yes.
Okay.
Let
This
me
is
see, I'm
my
getting
grand-
some chat messaging. Let me ask people. Let me send a,
They can see the whole slide. Okay,
Yes, yes.
yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you. And thank you, everybody.
okay, yes, they can see the PowerPoint. Good.
Okay, thank you for being patient with all of us. Anyway, this is my grandfather, Gus Flesor. Flesaurus was his name in Greece. And he was born in 1879 and came to America in 1901 to work with his uncle, Peter Viner. And Peter Viner was a partner with George Bakey in Champaign-Urbana. Initially, they came there in the late 1890s, and they worked in Champaign-Urbana, and they opened up a confectionery. And actually, George Bakey decided that he wanted to really learn how to be a good confectioner. So he went to Boston and went to culinary school and learned how to make candy. And so he actually then came back and taught most of the Greeks in the central Illinois how to make candy. And we'll talk about that as we move forward.
Next slide.
Anyway,
Next slide.
next slide then. Can we go to the next slide? Whoever's doing slides.
There we go.
Okay. Oh, okay. So here we are again. This is my sister and I when we first opened up, and we were much younger then, so we look perky. To the left is a slide of the outside of our building, which is large, around 1923. And the bottom left is the inside of our store as it is now, which actually has a lot of the original fixtures that my grandfather had put in particular the floor. And I think if you go to a lot of these confectionaries or even the buildings, there seemed to be a similar pattern of decoration among all the confectionaries. Our floor is 100 years old and is still in great shape. This is the outside of our building in our downtown, which is 4,500 people. So as I mentioned earlier, most of the Greeks came from the Peloponnese, and the next slide will show you where that, there we go. And Pigadakia, where my grandfather came from, is right in the middle. And as I mentioned before, very mountainous
Next slide.
terrain. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. There we go. You can see how hilly and mountainous it is. As I said, only 8% of the land was arable, and they raised crops such as raisins, currants, and olives, but there were not consistent prices for the crops. The constriction of the land ownership became more and more untenable for folks. The property taxes were rising because Greece had been in multiple wars. Athens was trying to put stockpile in their treasury, and the taxation of the peasants became just too much in addition to the army conscription. And so by 1880s as well, imports in Greece far outweighed the exports. So there were so many factors that enticed the Greek males in particular to leave Greece. There would be shipping agents from the large shipping lanes that would come to the coffee houses in the village and offer sponsorship to the young men to come to America. And if you could go to the next slide.
Oops, back.
Sorry, there we go. Patras was a port that was popular and familiar for the males to leave from. And during the 1880s, approximately 2,000 Greeks left the Peloponnese. Some actually went to Australia, some went to South Africa, some went to South America, but the majority of them went to America. And by the 1890s, 15,000 or more from a wider region of the country came to America. Eventually, most of the immigration occurred from 1900 to 1915, where 1 in 4 males came to our shores. 1 in 4 males out of Greece came to our shores, coming to New York, New Orleans, Massachusetts, and Chicago. The Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913 also spurred men to leave Greece. However, I learned this as I went along and did the research, and even among the Central Illinois immigrants, this was true. Theodore Salutos documented that despite the fact over 365 Greeks left Greece between the years of 1908 and 1930, up to 40% returned. And perhaps you have stories from your own family who had folks come over and decided for many reasons that they wanted to go back to Greece, because indeed Greece really was their home. In the Midwest, Chicago became the center. If you could go to the next slide, please. Became the center of Greek migration. And this is such an interesting fact. And most of the males came, and they started out as shoe shiners because at the time, transportation was mostly horse and buggy. But then they moved on because the horse and buggies went by the wayside. And also they wanted to be more entrepreneurial. And so the young men in Chicago morphed into fruit and vegetable peddling. And the Italians were also doing that, but it was a way to start their own business with minimal startup expense. They also did not need to be fluent in English, and as I mentioned, could work very independently. And you know, this is a theme that kind of ran through all of these stories, is that the philotimo approach to life, and maybe I'm not saying that correctly, but just the whole, you know, independence and being working for yourself was very, very prevalent. And the Greeks, for the most part too, even though some did work in factories, you know, a lot of immigrants came to Chicago, like the Germans and the Polish, the Lithuanians, you know, they worked in factories, but the Greeks just did not gravitate toward that type of making a living. Even though they were peddlers, the Italians were peddlers too. They were heavily taxed by the city of Chicago, and so they organized into the Peddlers Protective Association. But Greeks, as we mentioned, being the entrepreneurs that we are, really literally got up earlier in the morning and got out into the streets and were aggressive sellers. And they turned to candy as their own unique niche, either purchasing sweets from others to sell or eventually making their own. And so the Greek Star in 1904 wrote about the Greek confectioners being Chicago's pride, and that Chicago's the pride of 2/3 of the country. And that Chicago then became what was noted as the Acropolis of the candy making world. And here's an interesting fact: 70% of the Greek candy merchants in America, all over the country, were originally citizens of Chicago. And after they had learned the trade of fellow Greeks for whom they worked, and by saving had accumulated enough capital, they bade Chicago farewell and scattered to the four corners of this great country. So you have to look at what was happening in Chicago that Greeks were learning how to make candy. In the early 1800s in this country, in Chicago, Boston, and New York, candy was being manufactured at home and in small businesses by different groups, like the Yankees, like the Germans, the Swiss, and Italians. And by the late 1800s, domestic cookbooks and encyclopedias included recipes such as caramels, chocolate logs, and cream mint drops. At the beginning of the 1900s, the use of chocolate for individual treats instead of just for desserts was an opportunity for palates to expand. In Chicago, as early as 1869, Eleutherios Palalas of Sparta and Panagiotis Hatzidiris of Smyrna established a candy shop and employed early Greek male immigrants. Eventually, both of these men moved to the East Coast and they sold commercially made confections. Another Chicago Greek immigrant, Christos Sakonis, immigrated in 1873 from the northeast of Sparta, and he sold fruits and candy from a cart in New York before coming to Chicago. In 1875, he returned to Greece and brought 5 men from small villages to the city and helped them get established as confectioners. And eventually he brought 1,000 young Spartans to Chicago between 1870 and 1880. Some remained in the city and others branched out throughout the rest of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York. Could you go to the next slide, please? Says my husband. Okay. So as I mentioned, Chicago became the acropolis of the Greek American candy business, and the Saloniki Greek Press in 1916 said that a Greek confectionery store will be found wherever one goes in America. It is easily recognized by its white marble soda fountain and its immaculately clean interior. The Greek boys usually employed in such stores are pleasant and attractive in appearance. Their willing service attracts a great number of American customers. It is estimated that by 1915, the confectionery business employed 50,000 Greeks in the United States with 3,000 to 4,000 stores in Chicago alone. They organized into the Greek Confectioners Association in 1919. And if you could go to the next slide, please. This is one on South Halsted. And I love this store. You can see the floor, right? Same kind of pattern. And it says here, the 3 women at the left are candy dippers, and all the candies are hand dipped. And amazingly enough, that's what I do in our store. And the men made the candy. Now, the difference with our business is my sister makes the candy. So we're a little rebellious there. But if you could go to the next slide, right? Okay, here we are. The Greek Confectioners Association was formed in 1919. And you can see some of the famous Chicago Greek candies, some of which are still in play. Margie's Candies is still there, and Demet's Turtles. And I think they have that name copyrighted because we call ours Paul's Pecan Favorites, named after my dad. Dove Bars, the UCAN Candy Company is one of my favorites. They started off in Chicago and ended up going to the Quad Cities, and they were famous for their picanola candy bar, which is kind of like what we call our pecan logs at Christmas time. I think everybody knows Andy's mints. So also the Temptation chocolates, which were begun by the Galanis brothers. And there's a great book that I mentioned, and it is in the library, the bookstore at the Hellenic Museum, called The Entrepreneurial Spirit of the Greek Immigrant, which is such a great book, and I urge you all to run over there and get it. He writes about the opening of Demet's in 1924. Monday was the opening day of a new and magnificent candy store by the rapidly progressing Greek concern of Demetz. This new candy store is the 6th established by this company and is located at 330 South Michigan Avenue. It is the most luxurious and magnificent of all the stores and is remarkable for the excellence of its artistic decoration. The Greek company operates all its stores, which are located in the Loop, in a very efficient way, and this accounts for their success. And I want to mention that how important it is to realize that Greeks came over, males, they couldn't speak English. They really weren't candy makers in Greece. We get that question all the time. Did your family make candy in Greece? No. And they learned this trade, which became their niche. And they did this within the span of, 10 to 20 years. They organized themselves into an association so that they could be the public face of cleanliness, of professionalism, of making a great product, of being part of America, of assimilating. And I think that's really an important aspect to think about as we look at the first generation of Greeks coming to this country. Despite some of these larger stores and companies, next slide, please. Is it? We'll see.
Next slide.
This is not what I wanted. That the small confectioner was still the foundation of Greek entrepreneurship. And one of my favorite books is called We Make Our Own Candy by Theodore Zaffer. And it's a short but concise accounting of how one Greek immigrant came to Chicago and rose to own his own business. And John Zaffer began working in a large candy house owned by fellow immigrants, so either Demetz or Temptation Chocolates. And he worked hard for years, not only learning how to make candy, but also how to be in business, which was really important. So he worked for one employer who became unable to pay John his wages. So he offered John his store on Jackson Street. And he took a $12 a day business and increased it to over $100 per day in 6 months' time. And it was really important for him to turn his dream store into reality. He wanted a fancy store with old-fashioned carvings on the candy case and hand-carved booths and marble tables and cut glass windows and bell-shaped mirrors. He fantasized a much larger shop with a soda fountain this time, and he just had to have it. And so his dream came true at 42 West Division. It was just what he wanted, and now the long hours began. So the interesting then next kind of step from, we've gone out into the street with our fruit and things. Now we've gone out into the street with some candy, which we either made ourselves or we purchased for sale. Now we're making our own candy. And then all at the same time, which was kind of one of those perfect storms, soda fountains became very, very popular in Chicago. And as a sidebar notation, Chicago's first soda fountain opened in 1848 when the population there was approximately 20,000. By the late 1870s, a merchant could buy a small soda fountain outfit for $345 or spend 10 times that amount for a larger fixture. And such a great partner for confectionaries was the soda fountain. What a great extension. And to this day, there's American Soda Fountain Company in Chicago, which is like a huge warehouse of old, dead soda fountain parts. My sister and I went up there in 2003, and we had our marble bar, which had no guts for the soda fountain fixtures inside, so they customized a soda fountain for us. They took parts from soda fountain that was made in 1947. It cost $25,000, which I'm still not over. And not only that, we had to refurbish it last year because it was starting to kind of fall apart from use. but it is a soda fountain, and we make your Coca-Cola. We use Coca-Cola syrup and we put it in a glass and we fill it full of ice and carbonated water and we stir it for you. So that means we can flavor your Coke with cherry or lime or lemon. We can make ice cream sodas. We make our own ice cream and we have our soda fountain right there. So which is really fun for new generations of children, or even, you know, our own citizens in Tuscola, Illinois. Nobody grew up with a soda fountain unless they're my age or older. So it's really fun for them to come and watch us make sodas. So this slide before you, you know, you wonder, how did the Greeks learn how to make candy? And I mentioned that Mr. Beck, who was in Champaign-Urbana, went to Boston to learn how to make candy. But there's this amazing book called Rigby's Reliable Candy Teacher that came out at the end of the 1800s. And we still have this book. We have my grandfather's book with his notations in it. We still refer to this book. Not only does it have amazing recipes for small batch candies, but it also has chapters in there on how to set up your candy room, how to decorate your windows, how to manage your business. And I think for immigrants coming to this country, all of that great information was so, so helpful. If you then can go to the next slide. Okay. This is a recipe that was used and my sister has. And so here's how they come down to us, and it has caramel on the side of it. There's no real instructions, unlike Mr. Rigby. It's just, here are the ingredients. Add milk and nuts before taking off the fire. We actually have an open stove and my grandfather's original copper kettles, which we'll show you later. And next slide, if you could go to the next slide. Okay. Okay. This is a slide of all of the candy kitchens, confectionaries in central Illinois from the early 1900s, probably before World War II. And you can see there are over 50 of them. And this is from the eastern end of the state to the western end of the state. And it's just in the middle. It's not Southern Illinois. It's not up by Chicago. It is just our little part of the world. And you can see to the right, the map, which has Champaign-Urbana, Decatur, Springfield, Danville. They all had Greek Orthodox churches, which was really important as well, because when Greeks came over to this part of the state, they could gravitate and kind of have alignment with a larger Greek community in those areas. Champaign-Urbana had a university, Decatur had a university, Springfield was the capital of Illinois, Danville was also a burgeoning industrial town. And so some of the Greeks obviously gravitated there. And in my book, I talk about the Greeks in Springfield and Decatur, Champaign-Urbana, Danville is kind of small cities. The rest of these that you can see here are small towns of, could be 2,000 people, could be 5,000 people, 10,000 people. And all of them had one usually Greek male that went to that town and opened up a confectionery and a soda fountain. Usually some of them had food as well. But the amazing thing is that Mr. Beck particularly taught many of them how to make candy. Some of them, and we'll look at Robinson, Illinois, which is south of Champaign-Urbana. Robinson is where the Heath candy bar, Heath toffee bar started. And so the big question was, yeah, who invented the Heath bar? So there were Greek brothers in Robinson that had a candy store there, and they moved out, but they also could have made, toffee bars, but the Heath family was there too. And there was a Frenchman from Indiana whose father was a confectioner, baker. And so he worked for the Heath family, and he could have helped them make the toffee bars as well. Or they could have read Mr. Rigby. You know, the English toffee recipe is in Mr. Rigby. Or because everybody's on the railroad line, a lot of the wholesalers in Chicago who made the products to help you make your candy. And I'll mention a company, White Stokes, in Chicago, which is, I'm not sure if they're still in business, but if they were sold a few years ago. But anyway, Greek-owned concern, and they made fondant, and they made, you know, they could help you with flavorings and things. And so they would have salespeople go up and down the state and share recipes, and also, you know, well, here's what they're doing in Tuscola. Well, here's what they're doing in, you know, Greenville. And so just different ways that the word could have gotten out how to make the toffee bar. So I'm not sure what slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Are you there? Next slide. Is there a next slide?
Mhm.
Oh, there we go. So these are stop. Okay. This is Mr. Briner and Mr. Vanke in Champaign-Urbana and Champagne Candy Company. And a lot of these buildings are from the 1870s. And you can see that they're large windows and very deep buildings. And not only did they make candy, but then some of them sold cigars and tobacco. My grandfather did that for a long time. If you could go to the next slide, please. And this is the inside. And there's Mr. Vakey. And you can see these gorgeous soda fountains, and you can see that the men are dressed up with their bow ties and everything is really clean. And I will say also that at this time, there was a huge movement for health and hygiene across the country. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the backlash against foreigners. But one of the things that the Greeks were trying very, very hard to do and project to the public was that they were clean. Because as immigrants, that was not always the perception. And so it was really important to demonstrate to people that their establishments were really, really clean.
Absolutely.
Next slide, please. Why can't we do our slides? And here's my grandfather's brothers. My grandfather's in the background across from the soda fountain. And there's his brother, Nick, who he sponsored to come over. And he had another brother, Tom, that also came over and joined him. And this was one of our soda fountains that we had around 1913. And again, you can see just how gorgeous and beautiful it is. And it's not the one that we have now, but it was one that they had. And you can see just the old-fashioned ways that the carbonation was manufactured and utilized. So it was quite the production to make a soda, and certainly the ones we have now are not that elaborate. We certainly would probably break them. Anyway, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Oops.
Can you go back?
No, I think yeah, that's the next.
Okay,
one.
next one, sorry. Okay, this is the Palacos family, and their daughter was the one, Mrs. McAllis, who shared this photo with me. Again, you can see on the left there were cigars. And I will say that usually the women, and I do write about the role of Greek women in my book, that they were very important, and they may not have been out in front, if you will, but they worked hard, and they certainly were partners with their husbands and spouses in the business. This is Alex Karen in Springfield, and he was in business for a long time and was a great community citizen. And his daughter wrote about growing up in the business. And this is Mr. Samaras in Houston, Illinois, which is also a very small town. And here we are. They had, if you can just stay there, stay there for a minute. That'd be great. So again, I just want to emphasize that these were places of pride. Most of these businesses were open 7 days a week. Our business is open 7 days a week. And The Greek priest knows that if we're not in church, we are working. So I guess we're kind of exempt. But it was hard work. And as Mr. Zaffer wrote in his book about opening his place in Chicago, then the long hours began to make candy, to make ice cream, to run a business is a long and arduous day. And particularly around the holidays, Christmas, Valentine's Day, Easter, it is very, very hard work. So I want to talk about in particular, because this is a chapter that we don't really, what?
Slides.
Oh, go to the next slide, please. 2 slides. And thank you for doing the slides. I'm glad we sent it to them.
No.
Okay, if you can go to the next one. Okay, stay. Hold it right there. Anyway, I want to talk about the resistance that the Greeks experienced in real ways, and my grandfather experienced. And these are small towns, and you have to understand. So we're in the 1920s, early 1920s. And I know a lot of you who know the American history understand the Ku Klux Klan came to be in this country after the Civil War, because they were very much in resistance about slavery ending and their way of life ending. However, after World War I, the Ku Klux Klan reemerged. And at the same time in this country, there was this whole, I guess, resurgence of being American, and what did that mean? And I know that we're experiencing a lot of that kind of rhetoric today, which is why I wanted to talk about how some things have changed and some things have not changed in 100 years. The anti-immigrant and anti-hyphen 100% Americanism campaigns were being championed across the country and spearheaded by America's top leaders, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And Greeks were part of that resistance. Greeks were accused of being un-American because, particularly in cities, they established Greek schools. They sent great amounts of money back to their homelands, which they did. It was estimated that they sent $5 million back. And actually, the Greek government was happy to send the immigrants to America so they could send money back to Greece, because it was certainly helping the coffers of the Greeks. They read Greek newspapers in their coffee houses, and they became involved in labor strikes and did not immediately negate their language or customs. The new immigrants became targets of racist and xenophobic attacks across the country. And one of the first occurred in Roanoke, Virginia in 1907, where mobs of hundreds attacked Greeks and their businesses. In 1909, anti-Greek riots broke out in South Omaha, Nebraska, after a young Greek immigrant was accused of killing a policeman. It appeared that the catalyst of these attacks was the excuse to eliminate the Greek population, which was numbering between 2,000 and 3,000. They were viewed as clannish, immoral, unclean, and un-American. They were also targeted because they would work for lower wages, and the local native businessmen began facing real competition from Greek businesses such as grocery stores, confectionaries, shoe shine parlors, and coffee houses. Eventually, it was determined that the young Greek immigrant had killed the policeman, but the catalyst for the violence was laid at the door of the predominantly white community for inciting inflammatory rhetoric from city leaders fueling the riots. The Omaha incident triggered 2 other anti-Greek riots in Kansas City, Kansas, and Dayton, Ohio. Greeks were the in-between people. They weren't, and this is kind of that, what I call the taxonomy of whiteness. They weren't quite Black, but they weren't quite white. And in fact, one of my uncles, when he registered for the draft World War I, they put Oriental on his draft notice. Another Greek in Mattoon, they wrote down that he was Black on his draft notice. And so these are the interesting public kind of brandings, if you will. So they weren't quite Black, they weren't quite white. And there are two great historians, Roediger and Barrett, who write about the Italians, the Slavs, the Greeks, the Russians, that as they came over to this country, it took a while for them to become assimilated. Now, in the 1920s, you have to understand, since my grandfather had been in business since 1904, when he bought our store from Mr. Vakey and Mr. Reiner, he'd been in business, almost 20 years. And so here we go. The Klan now, one of the headlines here is Ku Klux Klan holds a band concert in Irvin Park, which is north of our downtown in Tuscola. They had thousands and thousands of people attend these gatherings, and they burned crosses. They burned a cross. You saw one of the slides at the beginning to the outside of our store. They burned a cross right outside of the store there, and it was totally to intimidate my grandfather. And so here's how I found out about the Ku Klux Klan. I went to work one day after school, because if we didn't have a school activity, we had to go to work. So I was behind the soda fountain with my dad, and my grandfather was sitting at the other end, and this old man to me, came in, and my grandfather addressed him in a Greek name. And the man smiled, hi Gus, how you doing? And he bought a Coke and, whatever. But I'd never heard that phrase. And so I asked my dad, I said, what is grandfather calling Mr. Smith, we'll say? So my dad dragged me all the way down to the end of the store, and he said, well, that is Greek for horse's ass. And I said, well, why is he calling Mr. Smith a horse's ass? And he said, because he was in the Klan, and my grandfather knew that he was in the Klan. And so, my grandfather stayed in business. Some of the Greeks, were boycotted. They were run out of their towns, but my grandfather and his brothers stuck it out. And I realized that every day Mr. Smith would come in and get a Coke or whatever it was, spend his 20 cents a day for decades, because this was in the, early 70s, late 60s. And my grandfather would call him a horse's ass every time he came in. And I thought, well, good for grandfather. So that was his way to get back. Anyway, I'm sorry. I have to finish up. My husband says we're running out of time. I just want to mention that public demonstrations in central Illinois had tens of thousands of citizens turning out for parades, speeches, and gatherings with the Klan. There's a great amount of research done on the Ku Klux Klan. There's a great book on the Klan in Chicago that I would recommend if you're interested in reading. It was very active there as well. But the Klan did kind of implode as an organization. And by the middle of the 1920s, they kind of went out of business. However, the Tuscola town as a town and the newspaper gathered around my grandfather and said that after one event where they were kind of notably pointed out as being evil to America, the newspaper writer from the Tuscola Journal said, and I quote, "The Greeks in some towns may not live up to our standards, but the attack was unfair to the Flesor boys who conduct the candy kitchen in Tuscola. These boys are all naturalized citizens. One of them was a soldier in the late war, and all of them have saved their money and invested in Tuscola property. They are prominent Masons and highly respected in Tuscola." And I think a lot of you know too, that AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, was formed in 1922 as a direct response to the discrimination against Greeks in America. The founding meeting was in Atlanta, home of the National Imperial headquarters of the Klan. So it was kind of a public back at you. Anyway, the Klan came and went, and my grandfather stayed in business till the end of the 1970s. And my father had come, and we had come, and my father retired, and we all left school. We all left to go to college, and I always said I would never come back to Central Illinois. And not only did I do that, but I came back to the place where I grew up. The next slide, if you could, please.
And then the next one.
Wait a minute. I want to,
Okay.
no, just
Okay.
go back. Thank you. No, go back. Thank you. Stop. Anyway, no, go to the next one. Matt, thank you. So you see all these balloons that you saw earlier where all these stores were. So there's one left, which is our store. The rest of them are gone. Although in Litchfield, there is a great restaurant called the Ariston, which is the oldest running business on Route 66, the original Route 66, and was started by a Greek confectioner and his son. He moved it into a restaurant and his son had it for a long, long time and just recently sold it, but it's still there. And we are the only ones left. And so you want to ask, well, why was that? So many reasons. The second generation, a lot of them were in the World War II and came back in with the GI Bill, went to college. My grandfather even sent his daughters to college, which was a huge thing. And a lot of people just became more professional. I think that they saw flipping hamburgers and making chocolates is not, the most prosperous way to make a living, although, it is. And so it just became not quite the thing to do. With the advent of the interstate highway system, all of these downtowns died. I went around to so many of these small towns and there's just nothing left. And as you all know, things moved out to the highways, which happened even in our town. And our downtown was empty for decades. And we brought our store back and now we're seeing other stores come back. Now, other larger cities like Decatur, Champaign-Urbana are a little different, but not much. A lot of those downtowns also have become abandoned. You'll have a lot of empty buildings. And it ebbs and flows. And I hope that over time, communities can kind of come back together and become a little more self-sufficient. But with technology now and the way people shop, just so many things have changed. And so we have become kind of a place to come that is a step back in time. Although we are also what we would consider to be an artisanal chocolate place. And kind of an attractive way to come to a small town and make candy and have a life. So you can go to the last slide. And this is what we do. We make chocolates, and we make everything by hand. It's a lot of work, but we have fun. We're very busy with our candy business. I can't even tell you. So anyway, I'm going to stop because I think we ran out of time. Yes. So thank you again. Sorry we had some technical difficulties, but I'm glad that my friends on the other end could get us through the slides. And thank you so much for all the preparation that we did to get us so that we could bring you this great story.
Thank you very much, Dr.
welcome.
Beck, for your very, very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Let me go to the questions. Okay, we have one question from Costa Darayorgas. Why did Greek immigrants decide to settle in rural Illinois? Was it because their family was already living there?
Yes, a lot of them. My grandfather as an example, but initially, so Mr. Vakey, for instance, came to Champaign-Urbana and Mr. Reiner because they heard the University of Illinois was a great place to have a business. So they said, okay, great, we're going to go there, and open up a business. But a lot of these small towns didn't have a confectionery or a soda fountain. So it was again, that perfect storm and an opportunity to go into a small town and do that. A lot of them use networking, like the guy who went to Arcola grew up in the same town as Mr. Vakey. So he knew Mr. Vakey and he came to Tuscola and then he went south to Arcola. And so, it was usually that was the case. And so they knew somebody, they knew of somebody. And so they did a lot of networking up and down and across.
This is not just central Illinois.
But this is
Small
not
towns
just,
everywhere.
yeah, but this is not just central Illinois. So let's, there are Greeks who ended up in Minneapolis or Milwaukee, initially, or rural Indiana or rural Ohio. And then they sent for their brothers or they sent for their cousins. Or a lot of Greeks too, when you go to Chicago, you would get together with folks from your own village. So then you would decide, okay, well, we're going to go here, and they all go kind of together. So there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of networking. That's a long
Also,
answer.
there is a question from Savas in the form of chat.
Charts?
Chat.
What is
It's a-
that? Does Savas have a question?
Yeah, I just saw it, but now it disappeared.
Oh.
Okay, if Savas has a question, please bring it up.
Okay, here it is. It says, please reiterate how all these Greeks learned the art of making candy. They were so numerous that it is a wonder how they all learned the business.
Mhm.
Did they learn it from the people who they bought the store from?
Different ways. Mr. Vakey is an example. As I said, went to Boston and actually learned to be a confectioner, came back to Champaign-Urbana and taught most of the Greeks around Champaign, Decatur, Tuscola, Arcola, how to be confectioners. Then there was Mr. Rigby, the book. You could get the book, and if you couldn't read English, you could get somebody to help you. But most of them learned from others. There was a lot of trial and error, I will say that. There was another interesting guy who ended up on the western part of Illinois, and on his way to America, he ended up in France, and he didn't have enough money to finish his passage. So he stayed in Marseille for a while, and he learned how to make candy because he heard that that's what the Greeks were doing. And as I mentioned in Chicago, the three Greek immigrants learned how to make candy from Germans or the Yankees who were in Chicago as well. And then they in turn taught the Greek immigrant males who came over. So there were 1,000 males who knew how to make candy. So they in turn taught others.
There is
Are you
also
saying-
there is also an interesting piece of information shared by Mr. Charles Psychos, P-S-Y-C-H-O-S. He says, the advent of television helped kill our family store, the Olympic Confectionery in Coudersport, Pennsylvania.
Oh,
People no longer came for ice cream after the movies. Just a comment.
oh, yeah, that could be. My grandfather used to stay open after the movie was over in our town, and he was open until midnight some nights on the weekends. But that could be, yeah, when the downtowns closed up, movie theaters and yeah, with TV and whatever. Yeah, that's true. I can understand that. Dairy Queen, McDonald's, they killed us too, right? Yeah, I remember when McDonald's, when McDonald's opened up in Champaign-Urbana, that was such a big deal, and people left our store then became it became old-fashioned. It wasn't the new hip hamburger place with fast food. We were not fast food. So we lost customers then, absolutely.
The next question is from Ellen Mamandras. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota in the 50s and 60s, and Regina's Fine Candies was established by Frank Elliott, parenthesis Evangelos Idiopoulos, and his wife Regina. I worked there through high school and summers. It was amazing and so very well respected. It is still thriving with 2 or 3 stores. I suppose this is more like a comment than just a question.
Is,
Do you like to comment on this?
I think that's great.
Women in Duluth.
There are 2 lovely Greek twin sisters in Duluth, north of Duluth, that opened up their grandfather's confectionery, so reopened. But I think that's great. I think it's easier to have a retail kind of business in a city than it is in a small town. So I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, Savas Kokchoglu has the next question, says, were there many Greeks in other states like Illinois who were in the candy business?
Absolutely. I get calls all the time, but I just got a email a couple weeks ago from a young woman in, or I don't know if she's young, anyway, in Connecticut, who said her family had place in New London. There is a guy in Minnesota. There were many, many Greek confectionaries in Minnesota, and he's archiving a lot of the history of the Greek confectionaries in Minnesota, which is great. And I urge everybody out there, if you are interested in exploring your family history, if they came over at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, I bet you can find a candy maker in there somewhere. So many, 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 many small towns across the country had a Greek confectionery and a soda fountain.
Let me ask a question. Has the business of the confectioner changed from the time of your grandfather to the present today, or it's typically the same?
Yes. I will say it is the way that we make our product. For instance, we're inspected by the health department all the time now. So there is that. And we have to be very aware of what we do and how we do it. So we're very clean. Still, we have to think about allergies, peanuts, those kinds of things. I know my parents never thought about that. Like, can I mix my chocolate? Can I dip a different piece of candy that I use to dip my peanuts with? No, I have to separate that out. We get a lot of questions about, are you gluten-free? Those kinds of things. So we're very aware of the way we make our product and what we put in it. For instance, we don't use preservatives, so that's a big deal. And we use as much organic product as we can. But we still make it like my grandfather did. We use my grandfather's copper kettles, and we, as my sister says, it's on an open flame with a stick to stir it. So, we make it by hand in the same way that my grandfather did. We're just a little more focused about what we do.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. Why didn't Greek Americans end up as a dominant force in the candied ice cream and Greek yogurt business?
Well, it became their niche.
It continues the question. I believe that the founders of Yasu are not Greek. Chobani, as the Chobani, was founded by a Kurd from Turkey who started out on the far left politically.
Okay. I don't know about, the Greek yogurts, supposedly. But as I mentioned, it became their niche when they got here. They didn't want to work in factories. They capitalized on, the candy craze that was taking over the country. And they got there first, and they were organized about it, and they did a good job at becoming entrepreneurs. And so it became their niche, and they were good at it, and they were successful at it.
You mentioned the clan. Did at the time of your grandfather, what was the dominant ethnic background of the clan at the time of your grandfather? I suppose they were Northern Europeans, but there were some
No.
More dominant of this ethnicity or other ethnicity?
Mostly Northern Europe.
Well, a lot of
Because
them were
everybody
northern.
came,
A lot of them were Northern European, but a lot of them were German extraction. A lot of them came up from Kentucky, and and so some were Irish too,
Right.
Scottish, and that was the irony of some of this, because when the Irish came over, they were also discriminated against. So I think it was the Southeastern European that was singled out. And in fact, if you look at, the laws that restricted immigration by 1924, the numbers of Greeks who were able to come to this country was greatly reduced. And, along with the Chinese Americans, it just became very much kind of a racial backlash, if you will. And so, for Southeastern Europeans to become American, they had to become very assimilated into this country as quickly as they could.
okay, let me go. I don't see any other questions here. So to give the opportunity to people if they would like to ask another question, let me ask another question too. Is in Tascola any significant Greek American community today?
No,
Okay.
there never was. It was my grandfather and his two brothers. And actually, there are no Greeks living there now. My sister, I guess, but no. In Champaign-Urbana, which is 30 miles north, there is a Greek community. There's a Greek church. In Springfield, there's a Greek community larger. There's a Greek church. There's a Greek church in Danville. There's a Greek church in Decatur. So there are larger pockets of Greeks. But in these small towns, it was one or two Greek males usually. A lot of them married American women. Some of them sent for Greek women to come from Greece to come and wed them. My grandfather, marriage was arranged. He told the Greek church people in Champaign-Urbana and Danville that he was ready to get married. And so my grandmother was visiting relatives in Danville, and he went and met her, and she was quite a bit younger, and they got married, and they had 8 children in a relatively short period of time. And my grandmother died not long after the birth of her last child, and my grandfather never remarried. So he raised 5 living children out of the 8. And of course, everybody worked at the candy kitchen like we did growing up. So.
Stefan, I don't see any other questions. Do you see any
I
questions?
had a question. I had a question myself.
Yes.
I
go ahead.
cannot, as a panelist, I cannot submit it in Q&A. So here it is. In one of your slides, you mentioned an article from Saloniki Greek Press
Mm-hmm.
in 1916, which says the Greek boys usually embroidered in such stores are pleasant and attractive in appearance. So my question is, weren't there any young girls working in those stores at that time?
No, not usually, because the males were the ones who came over in larger numbers. And the women usually, if they were part of the business, they were in the background. And they, as time went on, I would say probably after World War I and after into the 20s and 30s, then they kind of came out and became more public figures. But the women, no, the men ran the business, made the candy. Yeah, the women might have made some food in the background or dipped the candy in the background, but they weren't the public figures at the beginning like they have been. My sister and I are very public figures in our business, as are the women in Duluth or north of Duluth, and that's kind of rare, but we are rare. So, but no, the men were the ones who came over and they were the ones working.
There's also another sort of commentary or statement from Mr. Charles Sykos, who says that the grocery store freezer compartments also contributed to killing the industry because they made packaged ice cream available to everyone.
That's
to take
true.
home.
But here's the thing. So, what goes around comes around. We're very busy with our ice cream because it has very high butter fat, which a lot of ice creams in the grocery store don't. And it's homemade. And people like that, so we're back in vogue again. But that's true. When I was, and I will say, when Dairy Queen came on the scene, McDonald's with their soft serve, yeah, it hit us hard because it was less expensive. It was more fun. It was fast food, and we became very anachronistic. Yeah.
You mentioned that many of these small towns, the downtown has declined.
Yeah.
Is that because the economy has changed, namely the change in manufacturing, the agriculture? What are the main reasons of the decline?
I would say malls. Malls were built, and so they took the downtown clothing store and put it out of business. And Kmart came on first. Kmart, became, you could go there and get everything. So you did not need to come downtown and go to the clothing store and go to the dime store and go to the what? The hardware store. You could get it all in one place. And so the big box stores and the shopping malls destroyed the downtowns. And there are great books written about this. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Now you see shopping malls becoming vacant, right? With the advent of online shopping. So it will be interesting to see what happens. But we're finding people like coming in, and they like to touch things, and they like to see things, and they like to have the experience. And so that's what is attractive about our place. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. You mentioned that Greeks, they were teaching other Greeks their business. They were doing that, teaching them when they were, let's say, a businessman had some people working for him, so he was teaching them, and then these people, they were having their own business. It was not something done on the side. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Vakey employed a lot of young Greek males, and then they would go, like Mr. Samaras worked for Mr. Vakey, and then he went to another town outside of Champaign, opened up his own place, and Mr. Vakey, gave him his blessing. So that's how that worked. And he even Mr. Vakey even loaned him money. It was just a lovely supportive networking that happened in our part of the country. And I think that happened in many, many other places.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah.
So do you have any other questions, Stefanos? I don't see any.
Okay.
Okay, Kostas, there is one more question from Ellen Somopoulos.
Oh, I don't see it. Yeah,
It's a chat. It's a chat question. It came in the chat section. So she's saying, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Do you know where the candy store in Champaign closed?
When?
Yeah, when?
I want to say the 50s.
Mr. Reiner.
Mr. Reiner, well, the Reiner family, theirs turned into a bar, which didn't last very long either. So I want to say most of them closed in the, most of them closed, I want to say the 50s, 60s. Yeah, and some of them morphed into restaurants, which there are still Greeks running restaurants in Champaign-Urbana, so that's great. But confectionaries, no. And a lot of that was because the second generation didn't want to continue, or they got so old that they retired, and the third generation did not want to do it at all. So, and I counted myself among those. I did not want to be in the candy business, and I came back to our store to refurbish it and reopen it when I was 50. So I had already done other things. And my mother, till her dying day, my mother was not Greek, thought my sister and I had lost our minds. You know, she said, I didn't send you to college so that you could work so hard. So, yeah. But anyway, there you have it.
Now, let me
In the
see.
chat section, there are a lot of nice thank you messages in the chat
Oh, well,
section.
thank you. That's great. I appreciate it.
Words, they say excellent presentation.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
We would like to thank everybody.
I will say there were 3 or 4 candy stores in Champaign. I'm reading the chat. So they all kind of closed at different times. But a lot of it was because, you know, the second and third generations were not interested in doing that kind of work. It's hard work. And they went to college and they, you know, did other things. So yeah, somebody said if we had had a live meeting, Dr. Beck would have brought in candy samples. That's true. So, so I hope sometime I can visit with folks. That is true. I would have brought candy. So anyway, thank you all for your kind comments. I appreciate it.
Did you choose the topic for your PhD or it was suggested?
You know, that's a great question. I had a whole other topic in mind. I was writing on settlement houses, which is another long story, but Hull House in Chicago was very much kind of a focal point for the Greeks when they first came to Chicago. And Jane Addams was very instrumental in providing Greeks with recreation. She taught them how to become part of the working society. They learned things like, you know, how to use money. They did plays. They also did army formations and things before some of them went back to work or war with the Balkans, which was very interesting. There was a huge Greek community, as you all know, in Chicago, and Jane Addams' Hull House as a settlement house was very instrumental in helping the Greeks assimilate into American society. But I was kind of messing around with my research and we opened the store. So then people started coming in and they said, oh, you know, there was a candy store in our little town of Taylorville. Oh, there was a candy store, you know, in Effingham, whatever. And so I thought, well, maybe there's a story there because I knew my grandfather's story. So I went to my advisor and I said, what do you think? And then and we were very interested in the whole aspect of the Ku Klux Klan and the resistance. So he said, yeah, go for it. And so I did. And so that's how it all came to be.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
What's that? There are a couple of Q&As from Savas.
Okay. Let me see if I can see.
There is one that says, where there's so many sweet Greeks
One was, have you visited Pigadakia?
No.
I suppose, yes, no, yes. So I don't see the other one. Do you see the other one, Stefan?
Second from the bottom.
Why did
maybe you addressed that before? It says, were there so many sweet Greeks in other states like Illinois?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of confectionaries all over the country. Yeah, and I urge you all, wherever you live, to start doing the research because it's really fun. But everywhere, every state had Greek confectionaries.
Do you think that this is a business that finally is going to be taken also by the corporations?
Well, in some ways, you know, it would, but no.
Okay.
We're small time. So yeah, no.
Very good. So if you don't have any other questions, then we have to close it, Stefan. Is that correct? Do you have any?
Do you want to stay behind and chat, or do you want to close it for everyone?
Oh no, close it for the audience, and then we will chat a little bit.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Until I close it for everybody.
And thank you again, Thank you again, men. All my men.
Thank you
all
very
my
much
Greek
too. We
men
greatly
friends.
appreciate it. We learned a lot.
All my, do you need me to stay?
Yeah, just for a few.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay, I can do that. I'm gonna put my glasses on. Okay, now I can see you. Winnetka Sweet Shop. Ah, Winnetka Sweet Shop. James Polis. Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you. See, there were places in Chicago I didn't know about. That's great. Have fun. Oh,
I did not know about them. There is some sweet places, but they have mostly things that they serve in Greece, like baklavas and
yeah, yeah,
galaktobouriko and these kinds of stuff.
yeah. We don't do that though. We don't, that's like more of a bakery kind of thing.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes my sister makes baklava. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, but
You make taropa, is it?
we'll make spanakopita sometimes as a special, but the one thing people where we are don't like is lamb. They don't like it.
Oh,
We'll make pasticcio and nobody will eat it. So my sister and I end up eating it.
that's amazing.
It is amazing, but